Welcome to the Hunting Beast Podcast, your source for hunting tactics, news, and stories. And now your host, Mario Traficante.
Alright, well, welcome to this week's Hunting Beast Podcast. We're fortunate enough today to have the big buck serial killer himself, Dan Infalt. And Dan and I today are going to talk about his new DVD that just came out, Marsh Bedding. Had a chance to watch and review the DVD this week. Dan covers hunting fingers and points, as well as bowls, remote islands, and how to access those islands. So with that, let's get down to talking to Dan. Dan, how you been?
Earlier this week, haven't you had that thing for like a month?
I know I have. I've been busy.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that I get a lot of questions on why Marsh Bedding Chapter 3 is the first video I'm releasing. And it's easier to do the bedding segments first before I do the introduction and stuff. But I started with Marsh, and kind of reluctantly so because I've already got, marsh bucks out there. But I want to do this as a whole separate entity from marsh bucks and hill country, and marsh bedding sets the foundation and the basics behind scouting for bedded bucks. And it's easy to grasp it in a marsh, so I wanted to start there before I got into the more complex areas.
So when you're talking about marshes, just so everyone understands, I mean, you're really talking about untillable, unbuildable wetland land that's really can be sort of a vast mat of cattail marshes with either islands or pieces of timber sprinkled throughout it. But that's really the type of topography that you're talking about. Yeah,
and as hunters, we kind of lucked out and nobody really wants wetland. They don't want cattails. Farmers don't want it, builders don't want it, and the government kind of protects it. But what is nice is like in an area like I'm in southeast Wisconsin, you have a lot of options for hunting public land. And most guys seek out dry stuff. It's like you put 2 inches of water in something and nobody goes in it. And the other thing they're looking for is trees. So, at least a swamp has trees. When you get into a cattail marsh, the vastness of it is cattails, maybe mixed with some dogwood or something. But most people don't even realize that those are full of deer, and that's where they go to hide, and that's how they survive. And if you pick out a property that's dry to hunt and convenient, has trails and stuff, you better believe that it's hard for a deer to make it to maturity in that environment. Mm-hmm. You get into a cattail marsh where it's wet and solid cattails, you can get 6 feet from that deer and never see it. They go in there, they hide, and they survive. Some of the bigger cattail marshes I hunt near my house have some, are surrounded by private property. And the biggest bucks, when gun season comes, don't go running to the private. They go running to the public. Right. And that's hard for some people to believe. But, when you get out there, most of the hunters in the marsh are novice. The experienced hunters that know what they're doing got leases. They go get access. They buy a property. And they don't even think there's big bucks on the public.
To that point, if I'm looking at the average marsh, now let's say it's 200 acres, 500 acres, or even 100 acres of, mainly cattails, canals, maybe small ponds in there. What, to a lot of guys, I look at that and say, well, there's just this huge, vast area. How am I going to pinpoint or find where these bucks or deer are bedded in there with that large of an area? How do you, I guess initially, when you're looking at it, what do you see? How do you pinpoint it? How do you shrink that 500-acre area down to the specific spots where you want to go and hunt?
Well, I've got a 3,300-acre cattail marsh that I scouted just recently. I think it took me 2 days. Now, most people would be like, 2 days? It'd take you 2 years.
Right.
But you only have to walk that transition line. It's where the cattails meet the woods. It's where all the sign is going to be. It's where 90% of the bedding is going to be, and it's where your biggest bucks are going to be. They're going to be where the cattails meet the woods. And then you can even confine that even more and look for the points, the fingers, the little islands, the overlooked spots. And, you know, when you walk down that transition line where trees meet cattails, you know, not everything's created equal.
Right.
You know, some areas are going to have a lot of pressure from people. Some areas are going to be thick. Some areas are going to have fingers that go into the cattail marsh. Some are going to have the bowls that come out of the cattail marsh. And sometimes there's going to be little islands just off in the cattails. And they don't just bed out in the middle of the cattails. Well, they do if the cattails are dry, but that's kind of not the norm. When they bed in cattails, they're usually under a lone tree out there. They're near some bushes that are growing in the cattails, or they're growing, or they're right on the edge of the cattails and the trees. And when they bed on the edge of the cattails and the trees, they're looking for some advantage. Big bucks don't get big by bedding in stupid spots. They seek out specific types of terrain.
Right.
And on the edge, if they can get on a point or a finger that's narrow, they can get in a position where nothing can come at them from the side, because everything comes at them from the woods, per se, right? They can hear anything in the cattails. You can't get to them from the cattails. So they're really worried about the woods. So if they get out on a finger, on the tip of it, they can catch anything coming at them, because it's such a narrow path that something has to take to get at them, whether it's a coyote or a hunter or a dog or whatever. It has to come down this finger to get that deer. So that deer's going to monitor that finger. It's easy for that deer to stay safe there. So those fingers, you know, usually have good bedding on them. And most hunters haven't really picked up on this. So you go out to new marshes, and what's surprising to me is there isn't hunter signs set up on those fingers. And, you know, hunters are out in the middle of the woods doing what they learned on TV and seeking big rubs and scrapes and all that other stuff that's made in the middle of the night.
Right. You know, on their way to potentially getting to the transition line, they're you know, taken by the sign that they see, may it be a rub or tracks or a trail, and they end up setting up on that. If I'm walking that transition, what, from a sign perspective, you know, specifically are you looking for? Are you looking for tracks? Are you looking for deer droppings? Are you looking for different potential food sources there? And obviously you're probably looking for trails off the island and back into the island. So what's kind of like an aha moment that if you see something, you know that you maybe want to go out and investigate further in the marsh, or, you know, examine wind direction and things, that this is going to be a prime spot to set up on?
Well, I guess that kind of depends on what time you're scouting. If you're scouting in post-season, right after the season ends, which is one of my favorite times to go out and decipher the marsh, my best moments are finding a bedding area that's got worn-out beds that's off the tip of one of those points or something. And if it's hunting season, well, then I'm back a little bit, you know, and maybe I'm exploring a spot that I don't know for sure if there's bedding there, but it looks like, you know, a buck would bed there. Well, then I'm looking at the mouth of it, and I'm looking for trails going in there. I'm looking for rub lines coming out, and I'm looking for browse. I'm looking for tracks, everything you were mentioning a second ago. But I want to warn guys that you can't go out there and say, okay, this one's got mediocre sign, this one's got hot sign, this one don't, because a lot of times those bigger bucks, none of the other deer will go near them because they're bossy and they own a spot, and they don't make the rub lines like you'd expect. It's usually the younger bucks that really rub everything up. So if a place looks halfway decent, if it's got sign of deer going in and out of it, and it's a good spot for a buck to bed, I'd throw a stand at it.
Now, how do you know? I mean, you mentioned in here before how you've got, you know, this vast cattail marsh, but you can pinpoint these specific spots, and you talk about using aerial photos to not only look at that transition line, but also look at what's beyond the transition line. Maybe mark trails and then understand where those trails go, either to a clump of trees, or why is that so important if you're scouting a new marsh?
Well, if you think about it, well, what is a deer doing in the cattails? I mean, they're not out there eating cattails, right?
Right.
There's nothing for them to do out there except for to hide, to survive. So when you see heavy trails on those cattails, it's usually a connecting force of bedding. So when we get back to where and how a deer beds in the marsh, when you see a clump of brush in them cattails looking at an aerial, which shows up, night and day on an aerial, really well. And if you zoom way in with a good clear aerial, and you see trails going to that clump, there's a bed there. That's why those trails are going there. So
now this might be kind of a silly point or question, but as you sort of alluded to earlier, deer aren't going to bed lay down in water for the most part, right?
Right.
So a lot of these areas that they're bedding on out in the cattails are going to be some sort of change in elevation or raise in elevation. And what have you typically seen that holds that elevation? If there's an elevation point, what's one thing that usually holds that elevation is a tree?
Well, if you learn how to read the terrain, elevation is going to change vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
So cattails are growing where a tree really can't grow, kind of thing.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But there's lesser and greater variations of that. There's spots out there where a cattail can't grow, where you got floating bog and it's like a sawgrass where you put a leg right through.
Right.
And there's variations of cattails that hold beds. And this is something I haven't really gotten to too much in the past, at least talking about it. But there's areas like in these marshes that I'm noticing that you'll see all of a sudden you'll see a different height of cattails. And you have some that are dry for part of the year, and you get really good bedding areas in some of those dry areas of cattails, and you can locate those by the height of the cattails.
Okay, that makes sense. So, kind of a note for people that are new to this is that, those deer, specifically, mature bucks or deer in general, they're not going to be afraid to cross water or walk through water in these cattail marshes to get to bedding. But typically those bedding spots are going to be that slight raise in elevation, either some change in vegetation from the cattails to something else, and a typical really good point to key in on is if there's a disparate tree or clump of trees out in those cattails, that there's going to be a raise in elevation, which is going to allow for some sort of bedding.
Right. And another thing is too, sometimes you get out to these trees and because of the way the tree's sitting, they can't have a bed underneath it. But you'll still see the trails go to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they use them as some sort of visual marker. It's like they don't know where they're going out there, and they key in on something and head to it. And I know that sounds goofy, but you get out there and all the trails aim at those lone trees out there.
Yeah, I've actually observed that in some of the spots that I've hunted as well, where you get those heavy cut trails that are going through the cattails, and yeah, they do wind right to almost like the marker points where the trees are. And you can see that on topos on aerials as well.
Yeah, a lot of guys get the idea that deer go out there because of heavy hunter pressure, and then the only reason they'd go out in them cattails is because of pressure. They're out there all the time, and it's not easy for a deer. I mean, you see them that their legs will go right through the cattail bed, and they'll flop on their belly a lot. I mean, look at how much we put our feet through in the cattails,
Right.
And you'll see they have mud halfway up their body, and they're still going out there. But if you get back into the whole predator thing, where a deer evolved from, they don't like coyotes. You don't see coyotes walking around or swimming around in the marsh.
Right.
They don't see humans out swimming around in the marsh. So to get away from the whole predator deal, by getting surrounded by water and having that water as an escape.
Yeah, and you mentioned that earlier. I mean, even from a hunter's perspective, a lot of people don't like to cross water to get to the spots where they want to hunt, which, for some of these areas, if you're willing to, get your legs wet and your hands a little dirty, there could be a big payoff on the other side of that.
Yeah, I don't get it with the whole reasoning that hunters have. But you go into the marsh by my house, and I know you've been over here with me. Everything that's dry land that you can access from the road, there'll be a hunter every 100 yards during gun season. It'll look like a pumpkin patch. A deer couldn't even get through that, and you wonder, what are these guys thinking?
Right.
And then you look out at the cattails, and we'll go out there to some island or something, and you can't see orange for a half mile. There's nobody out there. They stop at the water. And, it's amazing to me, but, when we're out there shooting, and here none of those guys shoot. You see hundreds of cars in these parking lots. Nobody else is shooting, except for when we jump a buck and it runs out into the woods.
Right. So staging-wise, if we're looking at this, so you got a new marsh you want to scout. The first thing you usually do is you're gonna bring up that marsh on an aerial. You'll identify, a key transition line that you want to walk, and then also identify maybe some bowls or some islands, or even just clumps of hardwoods that are right off the points and fingers that you talked about.
Then, for a beginner, I would suggest you go right down that transition line.
Mm-hmm.
Walk that transition line, and you'll learn everything that we're talking about. I mean, if you're a little more experienced and you get the concept, you're going to start, after you get more experience under your belt, seeking out, when you got short time periods to scout, the highest, probability spots, and then you start picking out those points, fingers, the isolated spots, off the end of an island. You look for those islands that taper down to a point. When they taper down to a point, there's usually high ground right at the, the point portion that goes into the cattails that's thick, and that's right where the beds will be.
So, with working with island access or accessing an island that's in a middle of a bunch of cattails, how do you go about determining what the proper access point is to that island?
Well, that's going to what's going to determine that is if you're hunting in the morning or you're hunting in the evening.
Okay.
If it's the morning, I want to come from the deep out. I don't want to cross the trails that the deer are taking out there. So the best way to get out there in the morning is a boat, if it's a possibility, a canoe, kayak, because you don't want to walk up the same trail the deer is going to walk up when he goes in there. If that's not a possibility, you have to figure out which way the deer's coming from. You have to loop around and find a way to come in a different way. If it's evening, which is probably preferred, I think you get more success in the marshes in the evenings. But if it's evening, it's a little easier because you can go right up the deer trails. Because when they come out, they're going to have to go past you before they get to those trails.
To the trails.
Yeah.
And then really, what sort of distance are you looking for? I know you've showed this at a couple of your workshops in the marshes that we've gone out into and looked at, but what sort of distances, so people get an idea, are you looking for from, let's say, a point or a finger to those hardwoods that are out there holding bedding, or bedding that you've scouted that you know is out there?
Well, fingers are awesome because you can get right up them, right on the deer. Well, actually, the whole marsh is kind of like that. Most of my setups are probably about 75 yards from the buck's actual bed.
Okay.
And that's going to sound awfully close to a lot of people, but I know you've hunted with me, you've seen it yourself. Those deer that get up out of those beds and come to us, I mean, when it's a mature buck, it's usually about closing time, about the time we shoot them.
Right.
And we're within 100 yards of their bed. So if you're not, pushing that distance, you're not in the game, especially if it's a heavy pressure area. Heavy pressure does not mean, no big bucks. Cattail marshes create big bucks. Doesn't matter if there's pressure. Those deer will go out in those cattails and hide on people and not come out in daylight. You got to push that envelope, get on top of them to where they do move in daylight.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I'm killing them.
So I think a good comparison for this, I mean, especially when I was watching the video, this was ringing true to me on some of the footage that showed bucks actually getting up out of bedding and coming into these hunting sets, was that, you know, sitting in what was relatively a open plain of cattail marshes, but then there's a section of trees here, 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 and it was like clockwork where these bucks were getting up out of that one thick section and then walking that one or two trails that they had a route to where the setup was. I think, to me, it's much different than hunting either mature timber or, you know, clear-cut land where you potentially have a lot of new undergrowth. Because the same size area, if you have 500 acres of timber or 500 acres of partial big timber and some clear cut that's got new growth in it, it would seem to me that there could be a significant number of bedding spots or hiding spots that are scattered throughout that. And I don't know, after watching the video, it seemed like it's so much easier or straightforward to look at that big cattail marsh and pinpoint potential bedding spots. Because, hey, there's a lone tree, or hey, there's this clump of red brush or thicket here that could hold potential bedding.
Absolutely. And you know what? And the video kind of paints this easy picture when it's probably not really that easy to a lot of people. And the biggest problem I see most people have is they get into a place with a high deer density, and they're like, there's beds everywhere. There's beds all along the transition. There's beds here. There's beds there. The fact of the matter is, though, mature bucks pick the best bedding, and the other deer have to filter out and fill the voids. So you still just concentrate on those high probability spots, like I'm saying, those lone trees, the ends of a point, the tip of that island. Those high probability spots are the spots that'll hold the big buck, and all the rest of those beds you're seeing, just treat them like that. They're probably younger deer.
Well, and I think the other thing to note on sort of the ease of this is make no mistake that the theory is sound in its practice, but in order to actually get out and do this, you're going to have to be willing to put on some miles walking. You're going to have to be willing to obviously get wet in cases, and getting your deer out of there sometimes is a challenge, but it's fun.
There's
part of it.
There's a couple of different ways a guy can get a real big buck. You can get big bucks year after year by spending your life savings on it. You can get it by buying a huge ranch and keeping everybody else off of it. Right. You can get it by going to an outfitter, and you got this group of people that's kind of bitter to that whole thing because they don't have the money, or they don't want to take that away from their family or whatever, and they don't have to be out of the game because good old hard work and boot rubber will put you back in that game. If you're willing to do the work, you can make up for the lack of spending.
Right.
And you can feel a little more proud of what you accomplished because you're doing it on common ground that everybody else is going on to.
No, I agree completely. I mean, it's a lot of these areas, like you said, are hard to access areas, and that's what deters a lot of other hunters from going in there. So it's kind of one of those same old adages. If you're willing to put in the work, like you said, you can reap the benefits of it. Another thing I wanted you to touch on is, so when you're walking these transitions and you're looking for certain sign, obviously the wind and potential thermals play a big part on your setups in each one of these situations. So maybe you want to start with points and fingers and sort of describe how you factor in wind and thermal when you're setting up on a point or a finger.
Well, I mean, obviously I don't want the wind hitting the deer.
Right.
But you also, and I know what you're alluding to, you also have to watch the direction of thermals, because You won't see it when you set up, but if there's any kind of standing water on the edges of that marsh that we're in the sun all day, they're going to be warm water, like bathtub warm, and that's going to cool slower than the rest of the air in the ground. It's going to create a thermal, and it's going to be a vacuum effect. It's going to pull air from the ground to that water and up. It ain't like a thermal in hill country where it's really powerful.
Right.
It's powerful enough that if you set up in a way that the closest water is, 50 feet away and it's where the deer's coming from, as soon as it gets calm, all of a sudden you're going to feel that air pulling that way, or you might not even feel it. You let go of milkweed or something, it's going to go right to, that water. And a lot of guys get busted like that, and they're just like, well, there was a wind shift. But that wind shift is predictable. So on those points, I'm purposely putting myself up against one edge, up against that water, and pretty much so that little wind switch that busts most people don't bust me because it's going the other way.
So are you looking, I guess if a point is jutting out into a marsh, is it better? Well, I guess it depends to have where it would depend on the relationship of the bedding, but a crosswind coming across the bedding, or do you look for wind coming straight off the back of the bedding, so right in your face?
I'm looking for the wind that I think the buck is bedding there on. A lot of them have the buck bed in there on any wind. Sometimes a buck is in a particular point, more so when the wind blows right down the point, but not always. And sometimes a buck will, bed right on the point, like looking into the woods. When the wind's coming from the cattails out, he'll be watching the woods with the wind from the cattails right up against the cattails. But if the wind's blowing down the point into the cattails, he's a little further back in a patch of dogwoods, like 20 or 30 yards into the cattails.
Okay.
It's all the way a deer beds. I mean, it gets a little complex, but you either want to be able to see into that woods or smell it, if you get what I mean by that.
Yep.
And you got to take that into consideration when you set up on one of them points. And regardless of the wind, I mean, you got to pick the wind that the deer's going to be there on, if there's beds set up for that wind or whatever. And in marsh, it's kind of a little easier because a lot of times they're bedded there regardless of the wind. So you get a wind that's in your favor, but if it's kind of a crosswind or it's kind of blowing down that point towards them, you got to look at which way it's leaning to and push yourself up against that side so your wind's blowing over the marsh where he ain't going to cross your scent trail, right?
Right.
But then you put yourself up against the cattails so that your scent sucks into the cattails when it calms, and you get that thermal effect.
Right. So if in essence, I mean, general rules of thumb, if the trail's running right down the center of that pointer finger, and the bed, let's say, is out in a cluster of timber that's just off that finger, or let's say it's on the actual transition of the finger, and let's say you've got a pond or a small, there's a small patch of water in the cattails that's on the left-hand side of that trail and island, you're going to want to set up on that side because you're going to get the effect of, your thermals pulling out in there, and if the wind is coming straight off that bed to you, then that'll work in your advantage because he's not going to smell you as he's coming out of his bed, and if any of that thermal effect takes place, it's not going to cross the trail. It's going to pull out into the marsh.
Right.
Yeah, makes sense.
I guess for me, the biggest mistake I see on those points or fingers is people don't set up far enough down them. They got to really push the envelope and get close. I know a couple years ago I set you up on a finger, and you were probably 60 or 70 yards from the bed, not even probably, and you didn't you didn't see the deer that came out until it was probably too late to even shoot, right?
Yeah, in that situation, I mean, the deer that came out, by the time they got into shooting range, it was past legal shooting light, And we're talking, I mean, if I would have pushed the envelope another, 40 yards, 50 yards, I would have been in a lot better situation. But that's one of those things, like you've said before, is you only you learn that through experience and seeing it.
Yeah. Yeah, some of this you can listen to us, but you still got to get your feet wet. I mean, you got to go out there and experience it too. It's not something you can just learn overnight by me telling you something. You have to go out there and try the principles. But you do get, a huge advantage by learning the tactics, but you still got to go out there and learn how to use them per se.
So you talk about a bowl in the video as well. So the bowl is kind of the opposite of a point or a finger. So how do you see bucks using that bowl differently, I guess, or what features need to be included in that bowl in order for it to
the
be
reason
utilized as bedding?
a buck likes a bowl is because what a bowl is if you're walking along that straight transition where hills go into cattails.
Right.
If all of a sudden the cattails turn, go into the woods a little bit, and then come back out, that's what we're calling a bowl.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what happens is that's going to be shallower cattails. So it's mixing with brush and stuff, and they almost always got trees and dogwood and stuff in the cattails. Where the ocean of cattails is just cattails.
Right.
And now a deer can get in and out of that bowl from different directions, all the way around it. Usually there's more than one entrance and exit into a bowl, so they're a little harder to hunt. They're good to do with a team. You put one guy on one side and the other guy on the other, if you got a good buddy. But they're, overlooked like everything else.
Sounds like
something
you and I should do.
Yeah.
So I get it. So basically, you're getting this cut in to the hard transition into the timber, and then that's going to provide a different topography. There's going to be different vegetation growth inside that bowl other than just cattails, and that's going to draw them in there to bed. And because it juts into the woods like it does, you have these different access points in multiple places where bucks can get in and out of it.
Correct.
So then, when it comes to the next feature you list in there, really talk about is islands and remote islands. What size, I guess, do you consider an island versus?
Well, they'll bed on an island that's 10 foot by 10 foot.
Okay.
But try killing one on one.
Right.
Most of the islands I kill bucks off of are probably at least a quarter acre in size.
Okay.
And then it's, knowing right where the beds are and how the deer are accessing. Because usually they come up onto the island before they move off. Not always, but it's pretty common. So you got to think about where they're bedding. And another thing you got to do with islands is you find that your wind hitting that island does some crazy stuff. Like if you got your scent coming, if you're coming at it with the wind to back and a deer's on a point off to the side of you, mm-hmm. your wind will hit that island like it's hitting a rock, like water hitting a rock.
Right.
And they'll splash around and they'll smell you in the front of the island. So you really got to watch your wind on an island because of the way wind will roll around those trees that are out in the open,
I
it
suppose
sounds
that makes
goofy,
a difference.
but it's true.
That's probably pretty important based on the
like
direction
a rock
that
in
you're
a river.
Right, on the direction that you're accessing it as well, because same effect could take place as you're accessing.
Yeah, I'll circle around an island for a long ways to get into it the right way to not get that little wind swirl. I've had it kill my hunt too many times.
So what food sources have you seen out on these islands mainly that attract deer?
If you get an island that's got oak trees on it, you're golden. I mean, that early season, those things just, they're awesome. And, the oak trees are out in the open where you can kill a deer, and the bucks are tucked into that little dogwood point off of the island. So all you have to do is get in between, because those oaks need some higher ground, mm-hmm. and there's always an in-between spot. And that's been really a killer for me on islands.
Yeah, I think, what was it, been 4 years ago now? The buck I killed was in transition to an island that had oaks on it, and that was a setup that you and I had discussed, and you had planned out that you assumed based off the aerial maps that bedding was in one location, and we had oaks dropping on another island, a tertiary island, and that buck came right across the trail I was on his way to that island that had the oaks. And ironically, after the shot, he died. He ran and died right on that island, not too far from where those oak trees were. But
oaks are huge in cattail marshes, and that might sound odd because people think oaks are so great everywhere, but they're not really. Oaks can be a hindrance when you're in hill country or big woods or something where there's oak trees everywhere, because there's food everywhere. But in a marsh situation, there's only so much ground that can hold an actual white oak tree. So there's little clusters of oaks, and they're in key spots. And when you have a cluster of oaks on an island, and there's little, patches of bedding brush around, that's the key food source, because they love white oaks, and they're heading for that. And the thing is, if you got like 3 or 4 oak trees on this island, those deer know if they don't get there first, there's going to be another deer munching all those acorns that fell during the day.
right.
So there's only a time period to get those acorns, and they're in a race for them.
And again, it brings up the other reoccurring theme, because Luke brought this up when I did a podcast with him a couple weeks ago, that those big oak flats that are in timber, like you mentioned, that because there's so much of it, the deer will actually bed down in those oak flats and they'll feed right there, and it's hard to get access to hunt them. But in this situation, you've got this small island that's got a few oaks on it, and you've got high competition for that food source. So, those deer are going to come out of bedding to get to that island, and that's where you can cut them off and intersect them, effectively.
Right. And then again, there you go with your whole mapping thing. I mean, you can look at an aerial and see the trails going to that island from all the little clumps of bedding brush by zooming in close.
Yeah, so with that, I mean, how do you know, do you use those aerial maps and those trails on there where you actually print out those maps and then get on foot and mark them and find them?
Yeah, that's a good point. First off, before I get into that, I'm using Google Earth, and I'm using their timeline feature.
Okay.
So I can look at different dates of maps, because what you're going to find is that if you get a solid green map and the cattails are green, you won't be able to see those trails. But if you keep going back through the timeline, you'll get one or two maps that are clear, that are at the right time of year, that those trails just stand out. And those trails will be in the same place year after year until an event happens that, say, the cattails burn down, or snow gets real heavy and flattens them.
Okay.
And then the trails change a little bit. But you'll have the same trail in the same spot for 10 years or so. As a matter of fact, I've made trails out in the swamp with a machete. There's one that I made 16 years ago, and to this day, you can still see it on the last year's aerial, because the deer take it over and stuff. Because here's the thing, you can't just walk through cattails. If you think, okay, here's the island, and I'm going to go from this island, from this point A to point B, you're going to get about halfway there, and you're going to be swearing and cussing and turning around and saying, Dan Infalt's crazy.
Yeah, I think you might have sent me on one of those trips once. Did you forget?
Right,
Did you,
sent you to test
did you
the
forget?
waters.
Didn't you forget your release, or that was the story?
Right. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
I remember that well. But the truth of the matter is, you have to walk on those deer trails. So if you don't, you cannot fight yourself through solid cattails. You can't. It's not a cattail every couple feet. It's a wall of cattails. So there's only so many trails you can use. And, that comes in handy, too, because, as we've discussed in the past, in the morning, deer jay hook into their beds. Well, in cattails, there's an exception to that. When they try to get downwind of their bedding, there might only be 1 or 2 trails downwind of their bedding. So you know where they're going to be.
Right.
Where in other terrains, it's more guesswork because they're going based off of the wind and they can walk anywhere. So that makes mornings a little better in cattails. If you can actually hunt where they swing in downwind.
Yeah, and that is, that's a real critical point, because really in other terrain, deer have the option to move throughout that terrain and to navigate on other trails. I mean, if you're just talking timber or even hill country, I mean, you got to get some pretty thick brush in areas where it's going to impede their movement. But in those cattail marshes, anyone that's ever walked in there, I mean, try just hopping off one of those trails where you're sitting in a 7-8 foot cattail marsh and you're on a trail. I mean, it literally is a cattail pinched together every quarter inch, Now, obviously a deer has a lot more power and mobility than we do in those situations, but still they're not getting through that easily. And they're animals. They're gonna take the path of least resistance and the easiest path. So again, it kind of circles back on that point that even though this is a huge, vast area, if you use those aerial maps to pinpoint those trails coming in and out of, like you mentioned, the fingers, the points, the bowls, the islands, it takes that big area and it shrinks it down to just something that could be, double the size of your backyard, and that's really what you're hunting.
Yeah.
So what else should people know about marshes? What kind of equipment I know you're a minimalist when it comes to equipment in a lot of these situations, but what's sort of your must-have when you're going out into these areas?
Well, if I've never been there before, I'm taking a compass along and an aerial, so I don't make mistakes, at least until I get to know a property. Otherwise, I pretty much got a bow with me and a tree stand.
Now, most of the time you're just rocking your knee-high rubber boots.
If you wear waders, you can wear yourself out pretty quick. I know they got some lighter ones nowadays that are, better, but I take my boots and I put my pant legs over the top of them. Otherwise, they fill up with crap.
Right.
And if you put a leg through, if you pull it right back out quick, the water and muck will just shield right off and won't go down your boot. And I wear a tighter boot. I wear the muck boots, and then they don't fill up. In the old days, I used to wear those PVC Walmart boots, and that might sound funny, but I go through so many pairs of boots because I'm in the outdoors so much. I go through 2-3 pairs, so I didn't like buying,
right,
$150 pairs 3 times a year.
Right.
So I was buying the cheap ones, but those things were like we call them foot aquariums because they fill up with water and don't drain. You almost want to drill a hole in the bottom and just let the water out. But I'm not afraid to get wet. I don't know what it is with other people. They seem to be. The only time I really don't want to get wet is if it's bitter cold out, and then then it's a miserable hunt. But otherwise, I really don't care. You learn how to duck walk. What I mean by duck walk is you don't walk down the middle of a deer trail, because deer have sharp hooves and heavy weight. They punch right through that stuff, and the holes get worse and worse and worse down the middle of that trail. And it might seem fine. You might test the waters, and you're like, I can walk on this. And you're walking and walking and walking, and then you hit the one spot, and you go through to your waist.
Right.
So what I do is I duck walk. When I walk down the trail, I take my foot, and my right foot, and I swing it out to the right. And I step over the top and bend over cattails and step on the roots. Then I take my left, and I swing it out to the left, and I bend over some cattails and step onto their roots. I'm not walking on the middle of that trail. And by doing that, I never go through. So I rarely do get, wet.
Yeah, and that technique actually works pretty well. It works pretty well unless you're trying to follow you out of a swamp or a marsh and you're going fast. I remember we were scouting, it was last year, and you were cruising ahead pretty quick, so I'm trying to hit each cattail root as I'm going, and I stepped right in the center and filled my boot up full of water, but it was all good.
Yeah, I remember last gun season, Jeff G. From the website came out, and he was pretty good sport about coming right out in them cattails with me and pushing the deer around, and he was having a hard time keeping up with me. He's shorter, and And I kept telling him the duck walk, and he wasn't doing it right. And all of a sudden he'd disappear, and I go, look out for that hole. He went through like 5 times. It was kind of funny, but maybe for me, not for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that people remember is, look for those clumps of cattails. If you're walking through a distinct cattail trail, that's got 8-foot high cattails on each side of you, it's pretty easy to see, okay, I need to press my feet up against each side of this cattail wall as I'm walking through here. If stuff is a little more open, then you want to just look for those clumps of vegetation, and you might have to kind of clump.
You don't want to walk where there's no cattails. If there's no cattails there's probably a reason for that. You probably can't support a cattail, and you get yourself in trouble. So go around those, open sawgrass areas. And another thing that fools a lot of people is a lot of people think it's safer when the swamp is frozen, like in wintertime. It's safer when it's frozen solid. Well, I got news for you. There's always hot spots out there. The vegetation rots under the ice and causes hot spots, even when it's been, below zero. And ice will give you that false sense of security where you think you can walk over open spots where there's no cattails and stuff. And if you go through one of those spots and there's nothing to grab onto, a lot of times there's no bottom.
Right.
And I don't want to scare anybody because it's not really dangerous unless you don't follow the rules.
Right.
Nature has its rules and you got to follow them. So you stay in the cattails and walk where there's cattails, like you said, ice or not.
Yeah, that's good points. Especially if you're navigating in and out of these places in the dark.
2 years ago, I was hunting with Dave out there during gun season, and we got a bitterly cold spell right towards the end of gun season. And a truck drove across the pond, was out there ice fishing, drove past us about 20 yards. And right after that, I went through right to my armpits. So there's hot spots out there. And that truck was driving around out there in the ice all day.
Right. All right, so a lot of what we covered today talked specifically about marsh bedding. And, after watching this video this week and talking with Dan about these different features, specifically points and fingers, bowls, islands, accessing those islands, what to look for on that transition line. It's one thing to hear us talk about it, but the video does a really good job of just giving a plain Jane representation of here's a map, here's a potential setup, this is what you should be looking for visually. I think it does a really good job of getting straight to the point without sort of adding all that fluff or frills that maybe you see in a lot of typical hunting shows. That's what I like most about it. It's in more of an educational piece, so it does a good job from an educational standpoint of really pinpointing these bedding areas.
Yeah, I think that most people think of a DVD as like showing a bunch of hunts and stuff, and somebody showing off what they do, and that's not what we did here at all. This is purely education. Gets right to the point. Gets to the point of how, why, where, and when, and doesn't dwell on kills and footage that's pristine. It looks like it was filmed by a production crew. It's all rough stuff. Gets to the point, but you really come away with that visual. You can listen to us talk about it all day long, but when you see it with your eyes, it gets you that much closer. And I'm not trying to push DVDs on people at all. Just saying that if you're interested, you're curious, it's probably a pretty good tool for somebody who's just coming into this stuff.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great learning tool. So yeah, with that, we can conclude today's podcast. And again, if you have questions or comments or anything on what Dan and I covered on marsh bedding, you can hop over to thehuntingbeast.com and post your questions or comments to the forum. Also, if you're interested in the marsh bedding video, that's also available at the Hunting Beast store. We'll be looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks. That concludes today's podcast episode. Please go to thehuntingbeast.com
to post any discussions, questions, or comments regarding today's podcast episode.